Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the second episode of Rethink Reshoring. My name is Kaylee Nix, and I'm very excited to have you guys back with us for this episode. Joining me is, of course, Rosemary Coates, who is the head of the Reshoring Institute. And Rosemary, I think our first episode went pretty good. So we're back again today to dive a little bit into the decision-making process around companies and reshoring. First off, welcome back, and it's good to be here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be back, and hopefully we can educate the listeners on how to make a decision in favor of reshoring.
That's a conversation that I think needs at least like 4 or 5 episodes on its own, right? Because it's so nuanced and it is absolutely so much determined on a company to company basis. And of course, we can kind of take a look at general trends about what economies look like, about, if you're fleeing geopolitical conflicts or if you're trying to minimize costs. But at the same time, everything is very, very unique to companies' situations. And I think that we're seeing that a lot right now as people weigh the decision and weigh if they have the resources to be able to do that. So let's dig right in. Last episode, we talked a little bit about what reshoring is, what it looks like in the current climate. And I think we finished debating about the benefits versus some of the detractions. What does it look like right now for companies as they start to think about, okay, do I reshore or do I stay?
Well, it's very interesting because Bloomberg just published, actually in the last week or two, a statistic saying that like 90% of board meetings and investor calls in the past couple of months have included some discussion regarding reshoring. So it's really a hot topic for sure. But, executives sitting there, talking about reshoring may not know exactly what they want to do or why. So, it sort of starts with the idea of reshoring and then trying to determine what you might want to bring back. As we talked about before, if you have a heavy labor content in whatever it is that you're producing, you're probably going to look for a low cost environment. But if you have an ability to automate production and you have less labor involved and maybe a new product, then you might favor reshoring. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into making this decision. um, I think, thinking through what your products are is one. As you mentioned, geopolitical activity around the world, including over the weekend, we saw the U.S. and China having sort of a near miss collision in the Taiwan Straits. I mean, these kind of things raise the concern level about long supply chains and manufacturing in China and so forth. And so you may make a decision based on that geopolitical situation. But I think more often than not, companies are looking at the potential for bringing manufacturing back economically. So is it possible to manufacture in the US? And if so, what would you do? So I think, the first step is to really think through that decision and to talk about it at the executive level so you have an idea of what to go after. You might also think about IP theft, which is becoming more and more prevalent every day. I mean, we've talked about IP theft for a long time, but in today's environment, it also includes things like counterfeiting, global counterfeiting, which is a form of IP theft, copying, espionage, all kinds of things that are going on today that may concern you with respect to IP. So what some of our clients are doing is manufacturing the new products or the more sophisticated products here in the US and not taking them overseas or bringing them back from overseas and keeping the lower revs or the less complicated or sophisticated products, leaving those in your foreign factories, but bringing back the more sophisticated manufacturing and the IP and so forth back to the US. So that's, just one example of the reason why. there are, of course, many more. But let's start with that.
And I want to put a pin in that IP conversation because I've got some questions about that, specifically when you're talking about countries like the United States that have not only a very robust system of offshoring and reshoring, but also a very robust legislative process and protection process for intellectual property. We'll table that. Before we get there, though, I want to talk a little bit about companies deciding to move maybe certain products or certain pieces of their production back closer to home, because reshoring isn't necessarily an all or nothing approach, right? When you're a company,
Right.
especially if you're looking to diversify your supply chains, look at mitigating and minimizing risk, you often want to kind of break up where some of your things are manufactured. And it's not you're going to bring everything back home or send everything overseas. You can do a little bit of both, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we coach our clients on. It's really not, I mean, the word reshoring implies that everything's coming back, but that's really not how it happens. It's really a more of a global manufacturing strategy where you look at where in the world is the best place to manufacture your particular goods or have an alternate manufacturing site. So, we have to consider a lot more things these days. Let's take climate change, for example. You would think that would be kind of a crazy idea to consider. But when you have to worry about flooding, let's say you have a factory in South Florida and the typhoon and the hurricane season in South Florida is getting more pronounced more often, the seas are rising, that sort of thing, you might want to consider moving that production to a different place or higher ground. And the same is true around the world. In the Pacific, you have to worry about typhoons, which are their name for hurricanes. And if you have typhoon damage over and over again because climate change and the water's warming and so forth, you may want to rethink that decision and move some production to another location. That's just, of course, one example. Um, to mitigate risk, though, worldwide, it's probably in your best interest as a manufacturer to have alternate locations in case there is some event, a weather or God forbid, another war, or some other incident that may happen that causes you to shut down production in one place. So you may want to have an alternative place to move production to, even if it's just temporary. So most of the companies that we're dealing with are looking at alternate manufacturing locations because they are now much more aware of the risk because of the pandemic, which heightened the risk awareness, as well as things like global warming and IP theft. All these things are contributing to that decision. I would say also an awful lot of our clients are looking at Mexico as an alternative. It's a low cost country, especially in central Mexico. The labor rates are very low and fairly industrialized. So even if you're not looking for low cost labor, you're likely to be able to find industrial capability in Mexico fairly easily. And of course, you can just drive across the border. So you don't have to worry about your container sitting out in the harbor for 6 weeks. So those are, some of the things that are being considered, and there's a variable, as you mentioned. Every company is different, so you have to make those decisions individually.
So bringing production into a different place or changing up where you're producing things can maybe be a little bit more flexible, right? It's expensive and it takes a lot of time and you've got to pick up and leave. But what is very difficult is if you are a company and you're choosing to maybe reshore your operations, but now you have to look at bringing in your raw materials or bringing in those things that maybe you were looking at sourcing in certain places, because just because you move your battery factory to Mexico doesn't mean that you can automatically take all of your nickel stores, what you need for the battery packs, and stick them conveniently by your factory, right? What types of workarounds do we look at with going between the decision to reshore to maybe save costs or to de-risk their supply chain versus still having that need of sourcing your natural materials and making sure that they get there and they're able to do so in a now further location?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point because during the move to offshoring, and that was from the late '90s to maybe 2017 or so, 2018. Most companies were still really seriously considering offshoring. When that happened, then the suppliers went with them. I mean, the suppliers didn't stay behind in the U.S. They went too, and they started manufacturing their materials and their products in China as well. So when you're considering reshoring or bringing manufacturing back or to any other country, you have to think about your supply base as well. So, in order to solve that problem in the short term, companies may manufacture in the US, for example, and import kits or their component parts still from a foreign location, probably China. But over time, you want to redevelop your supply base in the US. So, those suppliers that went overseas with you 10 or 15 years ago may still have capability in the US. So you might look for products in the US that you can substitute. Or you may have to work with those suppliers to redevelop the capacity. So I'll give you an example. We were working with a client that was trying to find white lithium grease, which is a product that's used in manufacturing environment for machinery. And all of the suppliers had gone overseas. So while there were still lithium grease manufacturers in the US, there was no one producing white lithium grease. So we had to identify potential suppliers, talk to them about if they were interested in redeveloping this product, so that they could then start selling it to manufacturers that had decided to relocate here. So, it can take you 18 to 24 months to redevelop a supply chain like that. Your supply base, is going to be all over the world and may need to be restructured and redeveloped in the US. And that takes a lot of work. If you have buyers that are in the purchasing department, they're busy purchasing things. So they don't have time for a lot of this supplier redevelopment. So you either have to create new job roles for supplier developers or hire it out or engage a company like ours to assist in finding those suppliers. So, the whole supply chain isn't just about the top level and where what product you're manufacturing, but it has to include all the component parts along the supply chain.
And of course, all of that comes at a pretty penny.
Mm.
It's costly. Let's go
That's
back
right. Yeah.
to that IP conversation, the intellectual property piece of it, because that piece really, really fascinates me, especially the decision to move from a different country back into the United States, especially when we know that the United States has pretty robust policy and pretty robust channels for companies or individuals to go through to protect their intellectual property. I don't know how much you know about IP law and about copyright laws and things like that, so we won't get too into the weeds here. But can we talk about companies using that as a strategy or a reasoning to reshore, is to move them back into places where if they're creating a new product or something that has a really, really good go-to-market capability or go-to-market probability, they want to do it in a place where their property will be protected.
Yeah. So yes. So the strongest IP laws, I do actually know some about this. I worked on some legal cases as an expert witness on some IP cases. So in the U.S. and Western Europe, they have fairly strong IP laws that protect your copyrights and your patterns and the things that you would do to protect to produce a particular product. So those are all your IP. I mean, it's your intellectual property. It's how you manufacture something, what the design is, and so forth. So in the U.S. and Western Europe, they have a pretty sophisticated body of law that protects you, and you can go to court and sue a company if they steal that idea or that particular patent is violated, and so forth. Not so much in the rest of the world. So in China, for example, they do have IP law and they have courts that address IP law, but it isn't as sophisticated or as I think, standardized, I guess I would say, as in other countries. So a judge in one area may make a decision, and a judge in a different area may make a different decision. And the likelihood of you getting a favorable outcome for intellectual property protection in China is fairly low. You're likely to get a negative outcome, and the company in China is going to get the benefit of the doubt. And then the other part of that is that when you're operating in a foreign location, uh, if you register a trademark, then that is the evidence that a court needs forever. So I've had clients that had a particular trademark. They were operating in China, producing products in China, and then they decided to move, or somehow extract themselves from that production environment, from a contract manufacturer, for example. And they come to find out that the contract manufacturer, or the company that's manufacturing your goods, has registered your trademark in their name in China. So now you don't own it anymore. Surprise, even though you think it's yours and it's registered in the US and other places, if you haven't registered it in China, you don't have a leg to stand on when it goes to court. So, knowledge of the local environment, understanding what the laws are locally is very important before you take a risk like that. And so, usually we advise you to see an international attorney, or one that's familiar with patents and so forth in that particular company, and get your product registered. And it's not just China. I mean, you really need to look at this across the world. There are certainly plenty of cases in the Middle East where there's manufacturing that has, the trademarks have been stolen. In other places in Asia, Malaysia, and Indonesia, where the IP laws just aren't as rigorous as you would find in the US or Western Europe. So, that can be a huge problem.
We see that a lot when it comes to consumer goods and textiles, especially in the dupe culture, as we call it, where you have maybe a designer item,
Yeah.
which is of course produced in a very small fashion, slow fashion type of way, and then it translates into a dupe, and the manufacturers produce it in rapid succession, and they don't have a leg to stand on because
Yeah.
it's not the same.
Yeah, and it's not just consumer goods. So, we're not talking about watches and designer purses here. We could be talking about IP theft in all kinds of products. I always tell people, take avionics, for example, in the defense industry. There can be counterfeits introduced into the electronics of a product that look okay, and you can't tell them apart, and they seem to operate okay, but then they fail, right?
Mm.
Or they cause some other problem because they're not the true part. They aren't manufactured to the original design. So, I always think about this when I get on an airplane and buckle my seatbelt. I think, oh man, I hope there's no counterfeits in these avionics.
there's,
Uh,
there's,
so,
there we go. There's another avenue for us to go down, is counterfeits and what that looks like from a reshoring perspective as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. Counterfeits are a big deal. And there are lots of bodies and organizations that are trying to address these issues now. There's a big anti counterfeiting center at Michigan State University. I was just there a few weeks ago. They had an annual conference where they introduced a lot of new technology. There's, a lot of inserts and chips into high valued products. There's permanent barcoding. There's different things that can happen, as well as working with U.S. Customs to find counterfeits at the point of importation. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a probably good topic for another day.
We'll write it down. Let's move on a little bit to what the Reshoring Institute did a little while ago. You guys took a survey of U.S. American consumers and kind of polled on opinions about U.S. made goods. There was a while there where it seemed like everybody was talking about made in America, made in USA, that's the way to go. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those survey results showed, and were they surprising at all to you guys?
Yeah, we did this. We conducted this survey just before the pandemic. So we actually surveyed 500 people across America. nearly 500. I think there was like 497. And they were from all walks of life, all age groups from 18 through, I think the oldest was 82 or 86, something like that. All education levels, high school graduates, all the way through PhDs, all regions of the country. So we try to pick people from all over the place. And we asked them a couple of simple questions, very simple questions, easy survey. We said, do you prefer to buy products in the US? And overwhelmingly, the answer was yes. About 80 some percent said yes, they prefer products that are made in the USA. And then the follow on, the natural question was, would you pay more for them? And out of that group, about 62% said yes, they would pay between 10 and 20% more for a product that is made in the USA. And that's a really important statistic because we use that when we're doing economic comparisons, because we know if we can get the cost to produce between 10 and 20% greater than it is in an overseas location, that we can then charge more for the product. And if we can charge more for the product, even though it's more expensive to make here, then we've got a market. We know we can play into that preference that U.S. consumers have for buying American products. So we believe wholeheartedly that if we can get those products to be made within a reasonable bracket of costs in the U.S., that Americans will prefer them. They will buy them. And you even see this. I mean, we had other things in the survey. If anyone's interested, you can get it on our website, which is reshoringinstitute.org. But what's interesting about that is you can even see it advertised on TV. I think real steel products are made in the U.S. and they advertise that on TV. WeatherTech, they have a big deal about made in the USA, and it's partly because there's a perception, which we also noted in the study, that things that are made in the USA are higher quality. No, which is really interesting because we don't have any, we didn't qualify it in any way. We don't have any evidence that that's true. And I know from having worked in China for many years that you can get perfectly high quality goods from China or anywhere else in the world if you carefully monitor what's going on. But there is a general perception in the US that products that are made here are better quality. And that corresponds into the idea that Americans are willing to pay more for higher quality products. Whether it's true or not, it doesn't really come into the equation. It's simply perception.
Mm-hmm.
So, knowing these things and having that kind of context helps guide the decisions and the way we look at these decisions economically.
I think that that's a good place to bring this episode home with. We've got about 2 minutes left, but that idea of perception and consumer perception, and it's almost like an internal bias check, I think, for companies when they
Yeah.
decide where things want to be or where people want to see their goods come from, right? Do you guys think that that has an effect on companies' decision to reshore and where they choose to reshore? If they take a look at their target audience and say, well, you know what? We know that maybe a handful of Americans have an internal bias towards China, so we choose to move our manufacturing away from there, or other biases like that. And is that something that companies play into?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, whether it's true or not, and we always discuss this as one of the points when we're talking to clients about where they should be manufacturing. It's important to know how your customers feel and how they think about your products, and so it does play into the decision. I think it's fairly important to know that your clients prefer to see things that are made in the USA, and you can see, as I mentioned, WeatherTech and steel products are advertising they're made in the USA, but you can see it on all kinds of products where you'll see an American flag, for example, or an assembled in the USA that also has a positive impact. So, I think there's a real preference for it, and we're likely to see more of it going forward.
And that marketing can be just as almost as powerful as the manufacturing when it comes down to it. That does it for us here on this episode of Rethink Reshoring. Rosemary, thank you so much again for joining us this week. We'll be back next week with another one. In the meantime, where can people go to find you or to catch that survey again?
Yeah, the best way to find us is through our website, www.reshoringinstitute.org. We're a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization, so you can send us a message there or just email us at info@reshoringinstitute.org.
Awesome, and we will be live every Tuesday for these episodes. If you miss one, you can head on over to tv.freightwaves.com, find them on demand. You can also listen to them on any place that you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple Music, all of the above. Thank you guys so much for tuning in this week. We will catch you next Tuesday as well.